as you prepare to read Engaging with God, chapter 1, first of all, I want to encourage you to read the introduction first. As you start this book, the introduction is really helpful because it's going to tell you kind of where the book is going and how he approaches the subject. And so you really have a strong idea of what to expect and what not to expect in this book. Introduction is very foundational. But then as you get into chapter 1 talks about the Old Testament, and here's some key themes that you're going to be looking for as you read. Watch for the theme of comparative religion. The author's going to show you how a number of practices in Israel's worship were similar to practices in ancient cultures, ancient pagan cultures, but how even though the forms may have looked similar on the outside, how Israelite worship had a completely different context and a completely different meaning than the worship of the surrounding peoples. Now, so that's going to be a thread that you see throughout the chapter. Take note of it. Then here's some of the key themes that you're going to see. There's the theme of revelation, that God has chosen to reveal himself first, that God takes the initiative, and as he reveals himself, then that sets the tone for what worship means and how worship is enacted on our part. There's the theme of redemption, how Israel is worshiping God as a people who have been redeemed, saved out of slavery in Egypt. And so the redemption theme is an important thing to take note of. Related to that is the theme of covenant. And so how God actually enters relationship, he initiates relationship with his people and draws us into covenant with him, and how that covenant then reveals the terms on which we relate to God. And then there's the theme of God's holiness, that God is unapproachable by sinful people. Related to that is the theme of God's presence, that even though God is holy and that people who are sinful cannot simply approach him without some kind of intermediary, some kind of remedy for sin, yet God still chooses to be present among his people. And so that leads to the sacrificial system, because the sacrificial system is the way that God set up to mediate those two competing themes, his presence and his holiness. So the priests, the sacrifices, all the tabernacle, all of the rest was set up so that God can dwell in the midst of his people, even though they're filled with sin. And so all of that is played out in the Old Testament and defines for us some key themes that we're going to see throughout the Bible and even into the New Testament that reflect on what it means to worship God. And then the final thing this chapter is going to talk about is the relationship of worship and of the sacrificial system and the relationship with the prophets. Because later on the prophets would come to call people back to covenant faithfulness, to call them back to true worship, and help them to understand that worship went beyond simply the outward expression to be something that really had to come from the heart. So those are themes that you're going to look for: comparative religion, redemption, revelation, covenant, the holiness of God, the presence of God, the sacrificial system, and the prophets. So I trust that you'll take the time to read carefully. It's not an easy read, but as you get into it, God will bless you. You'll be encouraged by what God has done to draw us into the worship of himself.